All right, buckle up, because today we are talking about a political strategy so old, so predictable, that you could set your watch to it, and yet somehow, it still works. Welcome back to Australian Dish. I'm your host, and today we are cracking open the playbook Labor is running against one nation ahead of the next federal election. Spoiler alert, it's not rocket science. It's not even political science, really. It's just Politics 101. So here's the setup. Political commentator Chris Uhlmann went on air recently and basically pulled back the curtain on what Labor is doing. His take: Labor's strategy is to paint one nation as unpredictable, inexperienced, and frankly, a risk. Not a scandal. Not a conspiracy. Just a very old trick dressed up in a new outfit. And Uhlmann didn't stop there. He added the kicker that stings a little. Unfortunately, it's true to a certain extent. Ouch. Let's unpack that, because there's a lot going on here. First, let's talk about why this tactic even exists. Imagine you're playing a board game, and you're already winning. What do? You don't take big risks. You play it safe, and you make your opponent look like the wildcard who could flip the table at any moment. That's essentially what's happening here. The Albanese government currently holds a comfortable position in the polls, and rather than rolling out bold new policy swings, the smarter political move, at least on paper, is to sit back and let the opposition trip over itself. It's the political equivalent of winning a race by tying your shoelaces together with your rivals. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this isn't just Labor being clever. It's also a reflection of where one nation actually sits right now. The party, led by Pauline Hanson, has been gaining real traction, state election breakthroughs, growing primary vote share, and enough momentum that even coalition figures are publicly debating whether to strike a preference deal with them. That's not nothing. When senior Liberals are having open conversations about teaming up with a party they used to keep at arm's length, you know the political ground has shifted. But, and this is the part that makes it genuinely fascinating, one nation doesn't have a fully fleshed out policy platform yet. Uhlmann's point about unpredictable isn't just a talking point pulled out of thin air. It's rooted in a real structural reality. When a party's biggest asset is momentum rather than detailed policy, that momentum can be framed as risk. It's a bit like judging a restaurant purely on the queue outside instead of the menu. The queue tells you people are interested. It doesn't tell you what you're actually going to get once you sit down. So Labor's bet is simple. Let one nation define itself through vibes and protest energy, then swoop in and say see, no substance, just risk. It's a tidy strategy. But, and here's where we bring in the other side of the ledger, plenty of political commentators think this approach is more fragile than it looks. Let's shift gears, because this is where the plot thickens. Critics of Labor's small target strategy argue that simply calling one nation risky doesn't actually confront the underlying frustration fueling their rise. Commentary from political analysts has pointed out that Labor's cautious approach might avoid short-term political risk, but it leaves what's often called Hansonism completely unchallenged. In plain English, pointing at a storm cloud and saying that looks dangerous doesn't stop the storm from rolling in. If people are frustrated with cost of living pressures, feel disconnected from major parties, or believe their concerns aren't being addressed, simply telling them the alternative is risky might not be enough to keep them from voting for it anyway. And here's an analogy that sums it up nicely. Imagine you're trying to convince someone not to switch phone carriers by saying the new company might have bad customer service. Sure, that might give them pause. But if they are already frustrated with slow data speeds and rising bills, a vague warning about hypothetical risk isn't going to out-argue their day-to-day frustration. That's essentially the tightrope Labor is walking. Warning voters about one nation's unpredictability works right up until voters decide that predictability isn't actually what they are looking for anymore. Now let's bring in the coalition side of this story, because they are not exactly bystanders here. Under Liberal leader Angus Taylor and Nationals leader Matt Canavan, the coalition is having its own internal debate about how to handle one nation's rise. Some figures, like frontbencher voices pushing for cooperation, argue the coalition and one nation should essentially divide and conquer, agreeing not to compete in the same seats so they are not splitting the anti-Labor vote. Others worry that getting too close to one nation could alienate more moderate voters. It's a genuine strategic headache, and it shows that this isn't just a two-party story anymore. It's a three-way chess match, and everyone's trying to figure out who moves next. So where does that leave us? On one side, you've got Labor playing the calm, steady hand, betting that voters will eventually see one nation as too unpredictable to trust with real power. On the other side, you've got growing evidence that a chunk of the electorate isn't just chasing a protest vote. They are genuinely frustrated with the major parties and looking for something that feels different, even if that something comes with less policy detail and more uncertainty. And sitting awkwardly in the middle, the coalition is trying to figure out whether one nation is a threat to be managed or a partner to be embraced. Here's the bigger picture takeaway, and this is really the heart of it. Political strategies like paint your opponent as risky work best when the status quo feels safe and comfortable. But when a growing number of voters feel like the status quo isn't working for them, warning them about risk can actually backfire. Because at that point, risk starts to sound a lot like change, and change starts to sound pretty appealing. That's the real tension simmering under this entire story, and it's going to be one of the most interesting subplots to watch as we get closer to the next election. So, is Labour's strategy smart politics or a missed opportunity to actually engage with why voters are drifting toward one nation in the first place? Honestly, it might be a bit of both. And that's exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost in a 30-second grab on the nightly news, which is exactly why we dig into it here. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more no-fluff, straight-talking Aussie politics content that actually respects your intelligence, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me whether you think Labour's playing it smart or playing it safe, and I'll see you in the next one. This has been Australian Dish. Stay sharp, stay informed, and I'll catch you next time.